All right, welcome everybody. We're gonna kill time for maybe a minute or two to make sure that everyone can filter in and catch the very beginning of the talk, but we will probably kick off, around 1 or 2 minutes past the hour, so you just have to hang on for a minute or two. While we wait, it's always super helpful if you pop into the chat where you're from, sort of what you do, your level of experience with, either Hex the tool or the like specific vertical or space that we're going to be talking about today. I think it always helps us sort of like, maybe not change our presentation entirely, but like sort of turn our minds for questions and the various things to sort of add little notes about if we know what your background is in the audience. So let us know who you are, where you're coming from, what you do, and we're glad you're here. Um, cool. I think give it, 20, 30 more seconds, then we'll kick off. Looks like we got some data scientists in the crowd. Excellent. That's exactly who we want to be here. You're in the right Zoom webinar. Data engineers, also the right webinar. Cool. Let's get into it. Everyone else can just catch up as we go. Welcome everyone to another Hex Select session. My name is Izzy Miller. I'm your resident Hex expert, your expert for the day. I'm here with Matt and Kevin from Paytronix. They're both on the data team at Paytronix. And today we're going to be talking about how they at Paytronix use Hex to power hyper-segmentation at scale. We're going to talk about what hyper-segmentation is, how it's done, and why Paytronix does it in sort of a special, efficient way. We're gonna start with the big picture. Why Paytronix does personalization. Personalization, hyper-segmentation, I think, as we'll learn, are sort of two different sides of the same thing. We'll talk about their old world, of how they used to build their segmentation scores and why, maybe it was a bit of a painful old world. Talk about their new super cool setup for building segmentation scores, scaling that up with Hex, and then how they've been sort of using this new architecture to drive more impact from their data science team in general. It's a really cool talk they're going to give. Paytronix is sort of unique, well, not unique, but like relatively unique in the data sense in that like the product is data. So this is actually like a, customer facing external data case. They're building the product here that's being sold. So it's really cool, really high visibility, and the work they've done is really awesome. And with that, I will clear out and let the experts take the stage. I'll come back for the Q&A. So make sure to bank your questions throughout this. We'll get to them all at the end, but feel free to ask them in the chat or using Zoom Q&A throughout as they come to you, and we'll run through them all at the end. With that, Matt, Kevin, take it away.
Thanks, Izzy. Thanks for the intro. As you said, I'm Matt. I run the analytics team at Paytronix. So I guess the first question is, what on earth is Paytronix, right? A lot of you, well, I doubt any of you have actually heard of us before, and we're sort of in the background, but a lot of you on this call have actually used us before. So Paytronix runs restaurant and convenience store loyalty programs all over the US and a little bit in Europe. We've got like around about 1,000 clients, and if you sort of look at the list in the bottom right, you can see some of the partners that we work with, some of the big clients that we work with. So we really manage everything related to the loyalty programs. So if you imagine you're a member in one of these apps and you sort of get your offer that says, come in, buy a Coke, get 50% off, like in the image there. When you sort of like visit the shop and, you're at the point of sale system and you're actually sort of buying the thing, Paytronix organizes the rules, that sort of checks which items you've bought and then correctly applies the discount to give you 50% off the Coke. It does all of the rules, all of the points tracking. We have an online ordering system. So if you're like ordering ahead through any of these apps, we can do that for you as well. We do gift cards. We have a sort of internal marketing platform. And the bit that I'm responsible for, we gather lots of really cool data through these apps, and we have like a really robust reporting analytics function, which is really exciting. So drilling into actual data at Paytronix, sort of like two main use cases. Internally, we have a lot of data and we sort of like help out a lot of the other teams. We do a lot of work with marketing and building up marketing reports. So every year, for example, Paytronix publishes a state of the loyalty industry report, and my team will sort of help pull the data for that and like get some really cool insights. But the main function of the team is this sort of like premium analytical function for the types of clients we saw on the first slide. So as I mentioned, we gather loads of really, really interesting data about them, and we are able to make that data really valuable for them. So the first and sort of like most basic use case for us is answering any random ad hoc questions. You might imagine a client, they just want to understand their guests better. They want to understand everything. So they might come to us and say, look, hey, can you find us like every single guest who visited in January and bought this like special winter drink, right? So SQL query, return a list of accounts. And then they might sort of follow up with, okay, of those accounts, how did they compare to people who visited in January but didn't buy that drink in like February and March? So like really, really sort of specific reports that you're never going to get out of any canned dashboard. We can just write the SQL and like help them get to those insights. We also sort of serve as the BI arm of the company. So building lots of custom dashboards, lots of standard dashboards that are serviced to all the clients, again, for the reports that are sort of like less hyper specific and more general. And then part of the fun that we have, I call it like part-time data science, enthusiastic amateur data science. I'm not sure what the right term is there, but we build segmentations for these clients to use when they're sort of like marketing, when they send out emails. We build these really cool custom segmentations, and that's really the focus of this chat here. So this next slide, it's actually the most important one. Yeah, it's the most important one, because without this slide, we're just kind of having fun writing SQL and writing Python, right? This is actually what sort of like drives the value. So I'm just going to get the annotation up for a second. If you imagine this little diagram of 12 people, it represents every customer in a brand's loyalty program, right? So I've got the eraser. You can imagine if you're a marketer, you want to send campaigns to these people to sort of try and drive value, try and make the program interesting for them, right? The most basic campaign you can do would be just to send a, huge message to every single one in the program. Come in on Wednesday, get 50% off, get the buy one, get one on the Coke, whatever it is. That is sometimes effective, but what you find when you do that, you target a lot of people who didn't need the offer, you target a lot of people who the offer wasn't relevant for. It's like a blanket approach that is, it's just not the best. We can do better than that, right? So the marketers are always really interested in sort of like picking out interesting segmentations that they can send campaigns to. So for example, they might want to sort of target this little Tetris piece in the corner here, right? This little chunk of guests. And this chunk might represent, I don't know, clients who like to visit in the morning, right? So they might want to say, look, I want to find people who like to visit in the morning and send them a specific offer. Similarly, they might want to target this little L shape up in the corner here. And again, this might represent customers who like to come in with a friend, so they're going to be really responsive to a BOGO offer. Yeah. Likewise, this could represent, I don't know, customers that we haven't seen in sort of 2 or 3 weeks, right? So there's lots of different segmentations that we can provide. Lots of, I guess the sort of purpose of our team is to sort of provide these interesting segmentations. I'm not the expert in sort of like how to apply them to sort of like achieve the optimal sort of like return from a marketing standpoint, but it's our job of the team to sort of make these available. And you can imagine as you sort of like layer multiple segmentations together, you can get like really, really sort of specific and sort of like drill into really unique groups and to target them with the most relevant offers. And as I said, just make the program more interesting and more relevant. The ideal program, you're actually getting like less spam, you're getting more relevant offers less often, and everyone's sort of happier for it, everyone's the richer for it.
Before we crack on, I have a question about this. I find this like so interesting because I get loads of these emails every day and push notifications. To the extent you are able to share, like all of the segments you just annotated were like very general, like people that came in the last 2 weeks, people that like to come in the morning. To what extent do you see your customers getting value out of like the same scores that you replicate for every customer, or to what extent are they requesting, or are you finding like incredibly specific to their store scores, like relating to a particular menu item or like something like that?
Yeah, we really do the full spectrum. So there's a few sort of like broad brush ones which are just like universally useful, like what times of day people like to visit, what days they like to visit, whether they're interested in like the weekend or week part, like those types of things are sort of broad and applicable. And even like the the idea of like lapsing guests and the customers you haven't seen in a while, sort of trying to, we've got a really cool model that sort of like figure out an individual lapse and score for someone. You know, if you like come in every day, it'll target you faster. If you come in once a month, it'll target you more slowly. So there's, there is like lots of general ones which roll out to everyone. But then, we do hyper specific, sandwich ones. Sometimes it's like customizing the image based on stuff that you've bought before, and that is obviously only relevant to that one client.
Cool.
That answers your question?
Yeah, for sure.
Nice. Yeah, so headline from this slide, segmentation is valuable. Marketers want to segment in interesting ways, right? So how do we do that? So starting at the end of this diagram, right? I'm actually going to move the images so I can see. The marketers want to segment on interesting segmentations. In order to do that, those segmentations need to be available in the Paytronix software. For them to be available in the Paytronix software, our team has to put them in a table. If the table has a certain spec, if we hit the table with this spec, one line per account, per score, whatever it is, it'll follow through and be usable by the marketers. And in order for us to put a score in the table, we just need to write it and set it to some schedule, right? So we have a collection of tools we refer to as the data science platform. Quick caveat here, I've been with Paytronix 5 years, almost 6. It's been my only job in data. And I can't ever tell whether the terms that we use are like industry standard or Paytronix specific. we call this thing the data science platform, and it's just a collection of tools that lets us move scores from like the raw transactional data, transform them, and then put them in a table at some kind of schedule. And that's like an easy thing to say, but it's like really, really difficult to do, or at least it was difficult for us to do for the longest time at Paytronix. So getting into this next slide, this is a big one. And again, the caveat, this is just like how I think about scoring, how I think about segmentations. I don't know that you'd find this diagram in any sort of like textbook or anything, but it's what makes sense to me, right? So these are the sort of main steps that I think of. So when you're developing a score, you need to be able to read in the raw transactional data. So that's this square up in the top left. Then you need to be able to transform that in some interesting way, either using SQL, using Python. And then once you've done that, you push the results back to somewhere that the Paytronix software can read it so that's accessible to the marketers. That's for sort of like development. You go through that cycle a few times, fine tuning, the middle box, trying to get the most interesting score. When it's like running live, I actually kind of want to just forget about it. I just want it to sort of like schedule and then work on some software and then tell me if something breaks. So that's the sort of like the scheduling, the prod piece. And then you've got the deployment square in the middle, which is where you're going from sort of like one state of affairs to the other. And in the old setup of Paytronix, I'd say of these 7 steps, we had major issues with 6 of them. Yeah. We were using software that we just weren't familiar with. We were using languages we weren't familiar with. It was just like a really sort of painful, slow process. For example, right, let's just take the top box here. So imagine like I'm just going to go in and sort of try and build a new score, a net new score, right? We were using Jupyter notebooks running on Amazon EMRs. So the first thing you'd have to do was sort of like start up the EMR before you could open the notebook, right? So before you've done anything, we used to have to wait half an hour for the notebook to become available. Before anything interesting has happened, click that, wait half an hour. All right. Once that's sort of like finally provisioned and your notebook's there, you've got your notebook in Amazon, all our data is in Snowflake. Problem. How do I get the data from Snowflake into the notebook, right? We had custom packages to do it. If you could like sort of like parse them and then like find another notebook where they've done before. Sometimes you just sort of like manually download the data from one place and then like upload it to the other. It was like a slow, painful, involved thing. And then on the flip side, once you had your sort of transformation working, you had to put it back. So this notebook would write results to S3, and then it's like, oh God, I got to go back. I got to do that first step in reverse, getting from S3 back into Snowflake, so I can actually like inspect these results and see, do I like the segmentation? Do I like what it's doing? That kind of stuff. So again, this process took a really long time. Lots of these boxes in particular, just using skills that analysts aren't good at. I wanted my team to really focus on this. We're good with SQL, we're good with Python. This is where we're adding value. This is where we were just wasting time. In prod, again, sort of similar issues. using a lot of tech we didn't understand. So like it was Airflow where we need to get help from the engineering. It was running on the EMRs. If there was a problem with the EMRs, my team wasn't able to pass it. And then when things failed, which towards the end of the data science platform was like more and more often, we just didn't have the capacity to kind of fix it. Yeah. So in development, it was slow and painful. In prod, we were helpless. And the deployment process, I ruined so many of my own weekends trying to deploy on a Friday afternoon. So the rough idea with deployment, you'd have gone through your sort of QA, you'd have built your score, you'd have built your segmentation, and you'd have sort of gathered a load of artifacts, and you're like, yeah, I'll get these artifacts, the notebook, the model file, whatever else, put them in S3, and then set it up, right? Every time you had to like run the practice deployment, run the deployment script, it would take half an hour to spin up. And then every time it failed, it was like half an hour per error, right? So if you had a typo in one of your files, 30 minutes. If you put your model file in slightly the wrong directory in S3, 30 minutes of your life. If you did those two things correctly, but you forgot to write a line in a config file somewhere, 30 minutes of your life. And you could just compound these errors and waste an entire afternoon, just trying to move your score from dev to prod. So I realized, like, as I've talked about all this, I sound quite negative. It's like me, so this was terrible, this was terrible. I don't mean for that to be the case. Like, these technologies are great, but they just weren't the right ones for us. And this platform, when we first built it 4 years ago, 5 years ago, it was sort of revolutionary. So I always actually remember the first time I ever built a score at Paytronix, it was a k-means clustering algorithm, sort of like trying to put people into categories based on what type of, whether they'd like to buy burgers, whether they'd like to buy fries, whether they'd like to get alcohol with a meal, like that kind of stuff, menu item preferences, k-means clustering on that. And the very first one I ever built, it took so long to deploy, it took 3 months for the engineer to deploy. By the time it was live in prod, the client I'd built it for had left the company. They weren't a client anymore. Yeah. So this process took us from like 3 months down to like 2 or 3 days, but it was still pretty tough. Lots of steps where things could go wrong. And then sort of towards the end of the life cycle, again, like just more and more errors. And then the people that had initially built this for my team sort of like migrated away from the company. They moved to other teams, they moved to other companies. We just didn't have the people left to support us. So we sort of like reached that sort of critical point, rock bottom, and we were like, we just need to build something better.
That's before we move on to the better. This is just like one of the most real slides I feel like I've ever seen presented in a data platform presentation. Like, this is presumably the reality of everybody on this call watching this recording at some point has worked on a project that felt this way. Like, I know I have numerous of them. And I think it's like, especially on a team when, new people are joining and you teach them how to use it, I think it's so easy to like become the elephant who like doesn't have the handcuff on their leg anymore, but they still don't leave the cage, right? Like, you just get used to it. And you're like, yeah, like the notebook takes 30 minutes to spin up. And the new hire is like, okay, like they're like writing notes, like the notebook takes 30 minutes to spin up. Like, that's how it works here. And I think there's so many places where people have this like sense of like you said, right? Like, this was so much better than it used to be, where it used to take you 3 months to do it. And so you're like, oh, like it only takes 2 days. That's fine. And I think before we move on to the even better world, I just want to like, just take a moment to recognize that like this isn't some outlandish, like hyperbolic, over exaggerated scenario. Like, this is like almost every data team I've ever talked to or worked on or peered behind the curtain of has a workflow that looks like this. Yeah.
I mean, I'd say it was like worse than that. Is like everything you said is right, but like it wasn't just like we weren't thinking like there's another way. Like, we actually got quite good at some of these things. Like my analysts got good at these like wading through S3 buckets. And
yeah,
you guys could do it like fast.
You got the keyboard shortcuts all down, and yeah,
which is like great, but it's just not what I want them or need them to be good at, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so we rebuilt it in Hex. And it's the same slide as before, but suddenly the suite of tools has been reduced to one tool, and everything that used to take half an hour is basically instant. We rebuilt it in Hex because we'd actually picked up Hex a few months beforehand. It has this sort of like really cool notebook interface that just like so easy, instant bringing data in from Snowflake, right? And I was just thinking that I wanted to get my analysts more used to using Python, more used to using notebooks, and this seemed like a really, really good way to do that. So we picked up Hex beforehand. And then as I was sort of thinking through, you know, what do I need this new data science platform to look like? I realized pretty much everything was possible native in Hex. It's actually where I'm going to hand it over to Kevin to sort of save myself and rambling through this next slide. He's just going to show you what the templated notebooks that we built in the new data science platform. He's going to show you an example of deploying a score. So if there's no more questions for me, I'll hand over to him.
There's just, I think we're going to see this in reality, but I do just want to really emphasize this last bullet that you have here, which, you know, we've been sort of like talking about the other side of the coin at length on the previous slide, but like, yeah, everything's fast, whatever, like the analysts are working much faster, but like the important thing is that they're actually doing the thing they're supposed to be doing, right? Like, and I'm sure Kevin will talk about this. I'm sure we'll cover it more, but I just want to complete that like comparison, because that is like the critical change, you know, the stack, whatever, the tools, whatever, but like the people focusing on the actual job that they were hired to do and are good at.
This box up here, making segmentations that are really valuable to marketers, right? Focus on that, guys, and the rest will just work. Sweet. All right, Kevin, popcorn to you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Matt. I haven't introduced myself officially yet. My name is Kevin O'Hara. I'm a data analyst on Matt's team, and I'm going to show you how we can get a score live in Hex in the next 10 or 15 minutes. So let's start with the business case here. What I'm going to show today is how to generate a day of week preference score. As Matt said before, we collect a lot of transactional data from customers in loyalty programs, and among some of the data that we collect is when someone comes in and visits a business. So I have a small subset of data here that we're going to use to generate this score to figure out what someone's best day of week is. What day do I come into your business most often? We have 4 columns of data that we're going to work with here. We have a merchant identifier. It's just a number that corresponds to a business. An account identifier or account ID. That's a number that corresponds to Kevin or Matt or Izzy, a customer at this business. And then we have the day they came in, and then extract the day of week from it. So all 7 days here. This is just one simple score that we can quickly get out of the box and running within our system. But as Matt said before, we have generated a variety of different scores for our customers. Day of week being one, but what someone's buying, what category of item they're buying from most often, what do we think they could buy from next. There are a lot of other more complicated scores that can use this same template using a variety of SQL or Python to write something back into Snowflake that we can then use in the Paytronix software. But this is the subset of data that we're going to be working with today. We just have 4 columns here. Let's zoom in on an example here. So I have this one merchant and account that I want us to take a look at. If we look at this customer's visit history here, we can see they have come in on Wednesday 5 times, and then a couple other days, a handful of other times. So their best day of week should be Wednesday. As an analyst, I would get this request. We want to figure out what an account's best day of week is, so we'd start in SQL. We have access to this data here. I would write a simple query to output what someone's best day of week is, wrapped up in a final select statement here. Have some tie-breaking elements here where if somebody's number of visits is equal in 2 days, we take the most recent visit as the tiebreaker. But this should output what everyone's best day of week is with a code here that we can use to identify the specific score. As Matt said, we have a lot of different ones, so this code could be an identifier for this specific score. And then we have the merchant, the account, the label, their best day of week, and then a little timestamp for when this was generated.
I want to just point out really quick before we jump on. It's funny, I always do these, and Hex users always sort of gloss over this because it's just like the way that it works. But especially given what Matt was just talking about, like these SQL cells in this notebook, which again, I think later we'll see that there's Python support in here as well, or other things. But these SQL cells are directly querying your Snowflake warehouse. Up in the top right of this cell, you can see it says secondary hex connection. That's the actual warehouse. They've got their other warehouses there. You know, it has caching and autocomplete and syntax highlighting and all that good stuff that you lose when you do this in sort of the old way, and you know, like an Amazon EMR Jupyter notebook where you're writing some kind of SQL alchemy script to like pull data, or if you're just like downloading and uploading. It's a little thing, but it's actually like in many ways the biggest thing is that you can just write SQL directly against your warehouse right in this environment. So I just wanted to make that painfully clear because I think it's easy to gloss over the impact of just having that direct, like, secure connection hooked up.
You're absolutely right, Izzy. This is one of the main reasons why Matt pinpointed this as the next data science platform for us, because we can query our tables directly. So we never really need to leave Hex to get this score live. But we have this query written. I just want to make sure that this is outputting the correct result. So we have that exact same query here. And then we're just zooming in on that account that we saw earlier with a best day of week. That should be Wednesday. And we can confirm here that, yep, their label is Wednesday. That's the best day of week. So I feel good. I would obviously validate this with a few more accounts if it was a real score, but we got one, so we'll say that's good. So now that I've written my query, we're ready to get this live into a score. We have these templated notebooks that have most of the other aspects of getting a score live pre-built in. The only thing that I really need to grab and take along with me is my query. So I can just copy that here, head over to my score. This is a templated score notebook that any analyst can come in, copy it, and then input their score logic here, which can be any combination of SQL or Python. In our case here, we're just doing everything in SQL, so we only need the one SQL cell here. But I can paste that query in. We have a couple cells up top that have some troubleshooting or formatting variables. I have a merchant ID input here, which isn't critical at this point, but it will become crucial for us later. And then down at the bottom, I have a write-back cell that will write the results of this query here into a table that we can then access. A Paytronix user could access the results of on our online interface. So if I have this one score and I then want to run it weekly or monthly or daily, we have an option to schedule it over here as well. I'll talk more about scheduling in a bit, but let's just say this is good and ready to go. So I can run this. It will run all of the cells here. And then at the very bottom, it's going to write it back into the score library here. And then I can head back and see, when was this run? Let's get the exact run. So I'll copy that created date time here. Put that in here, get the iteration that we just ran. And then we can see all of those scores that I just ran up here are already written into a Snowflake table, accessible within seconds. So now we have
And
this
calling
score
back
live.
to, or no, keep
No,
going.
go
If
for
you're
it.
about to say,
What's up, Izzy?
I think you're about to say what I was going to say.
Okay.
I was just going to
Now
say,
that
like, now the score is live and written back, like that makes it essentially available in your product, right? Like this, it's such a tight iteration loop. Sorry if that stole your thunder, but I just thought that's super
no,
cool.
it's okay. Yeah, no, you're precisely right. So once we have this run, it's live in our tables and it's accessible to the Paytronix customer base. So this has already gone from a concept to something someone can use in less than 10 minutes. Now, it's popular. A lot of people seem to like this score. So now we're getting asked to run this for a few different customers. The next hurdle that we needed to get over to get this live and fully replaceable for our data science platform was something called a multi-merchant score, or a score that runs for 10, 15, sometimes 100 plus customers. And that we were also able to completely solve in Hex using one other notebook that we call a controller notebook. The controller notebook is another templated notebook that only requires two things for the user to come in and change. We're importing some standard libraries, and we're making heavy use of the Hex API tool. The Hex API allows one Hex notebook to communicate with another, and this was really integral to getting this working for us. The two things that we need to input are a Hex notebook identifier, or project ID. Every notebook has a unique identifier, and the API allows one to talk to another. The only thing that we really need to give it is the identifier for that notebook. So I would head over to my main score notebook here. In the variables tab, you can click on this to copy the project ID. It's also this value up here, but you paste it in here. And then a list of customers you want to run this for. I have a sample data set here, so I'm just grabbing a list of the 5 merchants that I have, but this could be a CSV file that you're pulling from GitHub. This could be some other SQL query with some criteria to grab the list of merchants. Whatever it is, we use the merchants, the merchant ID to make this multi-merchant score. And then once we have those two inputs, we can use the Hex API to run these two looping functions. The first one, it's doing a lot, but the main things that I want to zoom in on are it's taking the list of merchants that we have here, and it's taking that merchant identifier, saving it as this, we call it an input request body, but it's just the merchant ID, and it's able to inject it into the last published version of your score here. So the one critical element to get this multi-merchant is we need to have a text input or numerical input. I think this is a numerical one. It needs to be added to the app view. And then down here in our score logic, we're going to replace the hard-coded merchant ID with the syntax here, which will grab whatever is input into this cell here, publish it, and then once it's published, this notebook will be able to grab that list. It's going to grab all 5 of those merchant IDs, and it's going to input those merchant IDs into a version of the notebook just for that merchant. It's going to run it top to bottom. It's going to do that for everyone in the list. And then in this last cell here, it's checking the status of each notebook to see which runs are still running. I see I have 4 of them that are currently running. I can update this from time to time to see when they're completed. But it'll continually check the status of the notebooks in that list. And then once they're all no longer running, it will check on the status. If it's completed, it just runs past. If it's errored, it's going to grab the URL of the errored notebook, and it'll output one of two statuses at the end. If they all completed successfully, we just get a little notice saying everything's done. If any of them errored, it will output an error message with the URL of the error notebook, which makes another part of the before times a lot easier. We no longer need to wade through S3 buckets to find the error notebook. We can just copy and paste that URL into our browser. It'll open up the error iteration and it'll allow us to debug it live. That process really runs through the final step that I wanted to hit on, is how to get this scheduled. So if I wanted to schedule this multi-merchant notebook to run weekly, I would want to schedule the controller, the notebook that actually grabs the list of merchants and inputs them into the score notebook. I can add a schedule here and say I want to run this weekly or daily. Most of our scores run weekly on a Sunday at 8 a.m. And then you can either email or Slack. We use Slack channels for our successes or failures. But when a run succeeds, we can add a notification to a score success channel. And if something fails, we add it to a score fail channel. And those will just give us a monitoring step as well to make it really easy to see when things are running okay and when things need to be fixed. But that basically gets us to a live score in 15 minutes.
Something that when Matt was first doing it would take 3 months, and then with the data science platform would get down to 2 days or 3 days, and now 15-minute demo material. It's pretty sweet.
Yeah, it's really saved us a lot of time and made it a lot easier for us to get these scores live.
There's one thing I want to point out about the actual scoring notebook. I think is the best example of it. Another thing that I think starts to feel really just normal when you use Hex, but is super not normal to people that are just watching this and exploring Hex for the first time. If you start at the top of this project and then just sort of scroll through, you see a bunch of different kinds of cells. There's the input cell that's accepting input. There's a Python step there. There's a SQL step. There's a Python step. There's this native write back cell. And I think it's just worth calling out that the workflow of doing these kinds of projects in Hex is kind of flexible to the way that you want to work, in a way that a lot of other tools are not, right? If you fire up an old traditional notebook, you are now working the way that notebook is going to force you to work. In Python, you're going to be writing Python. You fire up the Snowflake console, you are now working the way that that console wants you to work. You're writing SQL, et cetera, et cetera. And here it's yeah, I'll use an input parameter because it'll be easy to increment. And then it's I want to do this quick formatting. I'm going to do that in Python because that's easier. That's what I know how to do. Obviously, it's easier for you to use these SQL cells to hit your warehouse directly. But then I think you're dropping duplicates down below in a Python step again, because that was easy. You didn't have to figure out or Google how do I do this in SQL or download and upload. And then rather than write some custom Python write back code or a bunch of DDL SQL statements, you're just using a native cell that we've provided. And I think at the risk of beating a dead horse and outing myself as a marketing hack, I think this kind of workflow that's much more flexible and tailored to the way that you want to work and the way that your team wants to work is where a lot of these efficiency gains come from, right? It's not just the templatization of this and the nice sort of seamless API controlling, but the actual notebook creation flow and the fact that the important work is done in a way that feels ergonomic to you and you're not being forced to make concessions because of the tool that you're using is where a lot of the efficiency gains come from.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been really easy for us to get everything migrated over into this platform. Within a couple of months, we were able to migrate over 50 scores from the old DSP to our new Hex DSP. And since then, we've launched 118 new scores this year. It's so much easier for us to get a new idea from the idea phase to the production phase with this interface, along with monitoring and debugging and just keeping tabs on things. It's really been a lot easier to use. Okay, that's all I have.
Cool. Um, that was really, really great. I think like maybe I spoke too soon because that last number is really the final cherry on top, right? Like it used to take 3 months to get one thing done. Then you have this thing that, makes it so you can churn one out every couple of days. And now it's like every 13 hours. It's pretty sweet. And again, like I know I sound like a broken record on it, but I just think this is such a cool example of the power of these like super fast data iteration loops because the this data you're writing back like is the product, and it's like every score you publish is like value delivered to customers. It's like money. It's the money for your customers. I think it's a sort of unusually like tight, fast value chain or like value loop for data teams where I think a lot of the time it's like, you're trying to, and you said you do this too, but like you're trying to influence an internal decision or like iterate on a product feature to make it, incrementally more sticky or improve retention by like changing this button or something. They're like these very sort of like long-term plays or small things, or maybe it takes a while to get into production. I think it's just such a cool example from you guys of like a really fast production loop. It's really cool. Thank you for sharing.
There's no problem.
With that, I think we should pop into Q&A. We have around 10 or 15 minutes for questions. I'm sure you all have lots of questions for Matt and Kevin, and we actually also have from Snowflake, Brendan on the line as well. If you have questions about the Snowflake part of these workloads, yeah, pop your questions into the Q&A box, into the chat, and yeah, let us know. I'm happy to answer questions about Hex. Matt and Kevin, I think, are happy to answer any question about the workflows you just saw. And Brendan can answer questions about Snowflake. So we got a wide array of knowledge here on deck for you. Someone asked, is the data notebooks available to experiment with? Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong. I think we are going to make these available for y'all. We'll send them out in a follow-up along with some other resources about the API. There's actually a session from last week that I did that has like a sort of more tutorial style dive into a similar like controller actor API model that I can share out as well. So yeah, we'll definitely share out that stuff for you. Here's a question for either of you, maybe Kevin. Someone wants to know how that last write back step actually made the data available to Paytronix clients. I sort of like jumped in and was like, that's so cool that now it's available to everyone. But how does that actually work, or what does that mean?
I can take that one. So the Paytronix software, when it actually executes these campaigns, when it sort of like filters down to, these are the accounts, these are the emails we're going to send to, it's sort of like doing that on like a Snowflake query to sort of like get like the list of accounts. So like the table that we eventually write to is just like the production table. So as Kevin sort of like demoing there, he actually sort of like skipped a step, which wasn't like super relevant, but we have multiple connections set up. Typically when the analysts are sort of like experimenting with these notebooks, they're on the QA connection. So they're just sort of like writing the data, the scores to a place where it doesn't matter. The deployment process, which when I was talking about before, would sort of take like hours and hours and cause a lot of stress. Deployment in Hex is getting an admin and then changing the connection. So we're changing it to an elevated connection, which has additional permissions to write to these like really important prod tables. And then we're updating the live score table, which is directly what the campaigns run on. He's nodding.
I just think, broken record, but I just think it's so cool that like the output of this frequent, every 13 hours data science activity is like a new table in the prod database that your production product like reads from. I just think that's super cool.
Thank you. And the 13-hour stat, I mean, that's an average across the whole year, and we're not even doing this full
Yeah.
time.
That's true.
Yeah.
It's like all 1 week, just every 2 minutes, Kevin's pushing a new score. The rest of the year, he just is in Barbados. All right. Any more questions? Fire them away. I guess one one thing that you briefly covered at the very end, Kevin, about like how easy it was to migrate those 50 notebooks. Can you talk about like what that actually looked like? Was most of the like legacy stuff just the actual like deployment architecture, or were there actual like things that you had to migrate from your previous approach to the Hex model?
Yeah. So once we had the templates ready, where we had the input cell, some of the like generic variables that we use, and then the write back functionality, most of the migration process was taking it was mostly written in Python because it was all running off of Jupyter notebooks, but taking all of the logic in the old scored notebooks and bringing it in to Hex. Sometimes we would convert it into SQL if it was a lot easier to just query our tables directly, but most of it was taking that old logic, which was mostly Python to begin with, and getting it into Hex. And
That
then
makes
once
sense.
we figured out the controller notebook, figuring out a way to keep that list of merchants somewhere accessible but secure. Most of the time it was a CSV, but getting that list remade somewhere.
Um, and one other thing that I've been curious about, like how big is your team? How many people are contributing to these scores?
13, 11, 13.
That's a lot of people. I mean, that's a lot of like, Matt, when you were talking about the 30 minutes here, the 30 minutes there, you scale that out, not just over 2 people, but over 13 people. Like that's that's pretty significant. Um,
You know,
what?
what we found is the pool of people who can do this now, it's greater. Before you had to be like sort of like really, really good at a lot of different things, and maybe only 3 or 4 analysts out of the 13 could get things. The senior analysts could get things to prod in like 2 to 3 days. Everyone else needed
Mhm.
help the whole way. Now anybody can do it in 15 minutes, as Kevin just demoed.
What what's next? Is there something on the horizon? Are there things about this workflow that feel rough, or that are starting to show the shadows of the old pain, or like what's next on the horizon for the data science platform?
So I mean, it's great. I mean, like there are failures, but like last week's failures was like a broken git connection, stuff like that, and failures like we can QA ourselves and fix. There's a sort of natural life cycle to scores at Paytronix. It'll sort of begin as like an idea, and we'll launch it to one client, and then hey, we love it. Let's launch it to 5 clients. Let's launch it to 10. Eventually, there's this critical mass where you're like, we want to just do this for everybody, right? And at that point, this infrastructure was sort of demoing of sort of like running notebooks one merchant at a time. It scaled kind of to 20 to 50, but it scaled to 1,000. I'm not sure. So there's a couple of scores which have sort of like really sort of like proven their worth. We had a great like future lifetime value, customer lifetime value score. And again, once we've established everyone likes this, we're going to make a move and make it available for every Paytronix client. We'll bring in additional engineering resources to help us. So some scores eventually will get taken out of this framework at a certain scale and then moved into something like Snowpark to run. However that works. It's always a proud moment for us when scores reach that point.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Now that we've opened the can of worms, do you or maybe Brendan want to quickly tell us what Snowpark is and why it is something worth migrating to, or why like that is the place that famous scores go to live out the rest of their days?
Yeah, I mean, from the Snowflake perspective, I would say, at least as it relates to using Hex, is that you don't have to move the data or you don't have to leave Hex for that matter. So everything can still be done there. It's more so just a matter of, and this brings to the Snowpark piece. Snowpark is a way in which you can operate more as a functional programmer with functional programming languages such as Python, Java, and Scala, as opposed to just SQL, still inside of the walls of Snowflake. So as part of that, it just opens up new personas that can access and utilize the data, but then also be able to build, sort of multi-code pipelines or modeling techniques or things to that extent. Again, without needing to go through some of the pains that Matt and Kevin discussed earlier on of needing to constantly move data and stage it in different places and sort of have a multi-step approach that could be cumbersome and time consuming. So yeah, at the end of the day, the takeaway on Snowpark is just the way that you can utilize Java, Scala, and Python with data directly inside of Snowflake. Again, still a single copy of the data, no movement required, still secure, etc. So Matt, I don't know if you want to talk more about your plans, but that's how I look at Snowpark, at least at a high level.
That's great. No, our plans are just more of the same. Just like more ideas, more scores, and more proving value, and hoping to reach that threshold where they're providing value not just for like the analytics customers, but for all the Paytronix clients.
Sweet. Okay, well, we'll wait a minute or maybe just a few more seconds if there's any more burning questions. If you have any burning questions, ask them now. This will be your last chance to ask Matt, Kevin, Brendan, any questions? Aha. There's always at least one at the very end. How does productionalization of scores work? Who are the personas who handle that kind of work? And I think that they're referring to like that sort of final step for the really popular scores. Like, who does that? When does that happen? How does it work?
Yeah, so the data engineering team, and they've got some like combo like data engineers, data scientists who just like have that sort of skill set of like understand scores, understand Snowpark. So we'll sort of like work with them, and then they can just make them run much faster and more cheaply than I ever could using this framework, right? Much more reliably. With as I said, the scale there, it's like an order of magnitude bigger than anything we're sort of trying to do in Hex.
Yeah. But the separation of concerns, right, is like, would they know what an interesting score would be to build for a customer, right? It's like it's not just a technical separation of concerns, right? It's like all this domain knowledge that your analyst teams have that makes them the right people to build the majority of the scores, right?
Yeah. And as you sort of touched on at the start, a lot of the things we do are just like really personalized to a single client, and they don't make sort of sense to sort of scale to 1,000. So it's the right solution for everything.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you guys. This was a really neat workload again for the 10 millionth time. I just think it's so cool to see like a data science, data analyst workload that's like so tightly mated to production value for customers. I think it's just a really neat workload. Thank you for sharing it. And thanks for answering all these questions. And yeah, have a great day. We'll see you all later. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.